want to thank everyone for coming this morning. I want to invite you to go on a journey with me today. We are setting up the next series of lessons in our Exodus study on Wednesday evenings, and I had asked Matt, in putting the schedule together, to give us a couple of extra lessons apart from the Wednesdays so we could fit everything in. And today I want to go through and give an overview of the section that we'll be studying and try to gain some lessons for us from that section. So as we do that, I hope you'll kind of take the things that we talk about today and keep those in your mind, because as the next presenters throughout the month of January go over their lessons, they're going to expand on each of these topics and go into more detail. But I wanted to look at some specific lessons that we can learn if we look through this section at a high level. When we go back and think about the Israelites and we think about them being in Egypt, we think about them being under slavery. And for many generations they had been there already. Some of that was not under slavery, some of that was by choice, by moving there. And they'd spent a great deal of time there. And so when we think about the slavery piece of this, the question comes to mind, well, why would they be drawn back to that? When they have left Egypt and they have crossed the Red Sea, why would they start to talk about it would be better if we were back there? That may seem confusing to us because we're thinking, well, that wasn't a good place to be, so why would you want to go back to that? Well, the answer comes from the fact that we tend to acclimate to places we're in, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force. And that's what had happened to them. For generations they had been there, and in some sense they had acclimated to the area because that's just where they had lived. But of course by force, through slavery, they had also had to acclimate to what their life was at that point. And so if that's what you know, and that's what your life is, and that's home to you, even when it's not good, it's still home. And it's a place that you're drawn back to. It's easy to see how they could acclimate. If you think about it, and if you've ever traveled much or been outside of the country and spent time outside of the country, maybe you know what I'm talking about. You kind of start to acclimate a bit to the area where you're in. And I've talked before about my time working in Canada for 3 years, and I started to understand this a little bit because I acclimated to that area. I mean, to this day, I still have conversations sometimes, and I'll finish the conversation with, "Eh? That was a pretty good piece of pie, eh?" It was just something that you kind of pick up in talking with people. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I love maple syrup. It's the real stuff. I love it. It's wonderful. We acclimate to places, and they had acclimated, so it's not unusual if they would be drawn back to that lifestyle. And so when we think about this journey from slavery to the mountain, I want to also think about it in terms of from slavery to freedom, going from one place to another. And so what we're going to see is we pick this journey up at the Red Sea crossing, right after they have crossed over the Red Sea. We're going to start in that point, and then we're going to move forward, and we find that then they come to an issue of water. John's going to talk about this afternoon, but there's this issue of water that comes up. What are we going to drink? And then next we see food. They need food, and so God provides manna. Bryson's going to talk about this in an upcoming lesson. Well, then there's the Amalekites. Along the way, they find a place that's pretty good. They find water, they find some rest, but along comes the Amalekites to cause trouble and cause problems for them. Well, then after that, we see them moving along, and Moses is given some wise counsel. Scott's going to talk about this, Scott Barris. We'll go over this section. And then lastly, they end up at Mount Sinai. And this is not the complete journey. We know from reading Exodus that there's much more to come. But this section of the journey is important. We begin to learn important facts about our relationship with God when we look at this part of the journey. You think about the journey that they took through here, and God could have chosen a different route. God could have taken them a different direction. I mean, for that matter, God could have just picked them up out of Egypt and dropped them in the promised land if he wanted to, but he didn't do that. And the reason is there's an important thing that they needed to learn, several things, by going through this desert. They needed to understand certain things about their life and learn to change things in their life if they were going to continue on this journey. And so God couldn't just pick them up and move them somewhere. God needed them to go through this journey. It was an important part. And the same applies to us. God has a plan specifically for our life, and sometimes we have to go through these things and the difficulties in our journey. When we think about going back just a little bit, I'm going to backtrack before they crossed the Red Sea. I want to go back to this verse, and Terry talked about this, and Lucas covered some other pieces related to this as well. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 10, and then verse 12, it says, "And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And so they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord." And then in verse 12, "Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt?" They're speaking to Moses here, saying, "Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness." The Egyptians are hot on their tail, and they're standing there looking at the sea, and what are we going to do? And they are scared. And they said, "We should have just stayed home. That would have been better." We look at our lives sometimes this way. We get to a point where sin is right behind us. It's following us. Difficulties are following us. And it might be easier for us to look at our life and say, well, I just need to go right back to what I was doing. It was easier then, rather than going forward. We find ourselves in this place where sin is enticing us to return, to come back. Times that were perceived to be better are in front of us, and we're saying, well, maybe we should just go back to those things. We're standing there, however, looking through the waters, looking forward in our life where the waters have parted and there's a bright future ahead. It's unknown to us. We don't know what it's going to be. We know the past is behind us, and we know that those things are calling us back, but we know what's out there. We know that God is leading us forward, and we find ourselves in that place. And so when we see Moses answering their concern here in verse 13 and 14, he says to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." Moses reassures them, yes, the past is calling to you. It might seem like it's a good place to go. It might seem like you want to be there, but it's not where you want to be. And he says, you need to stand still. Listen. Let God lead you where you need to go, and he will do that. Well, we see coming up then the next thing. So they have crossed, and they have gotten beyond the sea, and the water's closed in. The Egyptians have been crushed. The army is no more. And now here they are in the desert. And now they need something to drink. They need water. And John, like I said, is going to get into this afternoon, so I don't want to step on him too much with this. But I picked out this one verse in chapter 15, verse 26. "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight," and he continues to tell them, if you do this, the diseases, the things that I brought upon the Egyptians, they're not going to harm you. I'll make sure of that. Listen to me is what he's saying. And so he's giving that first prescription there, if you will, for health, which is to listen. They need to listen to him. And that's the first message they had to learn. When they came through the waters, they needed to listen. And if you take those letters in the word listen and you rearrange them a little bit, you get the word silent. They needed to learn to be silent. How easy is it for us to let our mind and maybe our mouth run away with us? How easy is it for us to start looking at the problems before us and start to try to figure them out on our own? To say, I need to sort this out. And we start to talk out loud and we start to say, what about this and what about that? And we should do this and why didn't we do that? And we start to overthink it and we don't stop to listen. We don't stop long enough to be silent and let God tell us what needs to happen. We don't tune out all the things of the world that are noise and let his word speak to us. That's the first lesson they had to learn. You need to be silent for a little bit. You need to listen and listen to God because he's going to help you. In Proverbs 18 and verse 2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. Listening is important. And he says it's foolishness to make your primary focus to get out there what you want to say. That's what they were doing. They just want to get the complaints out there. They didn't want to stop long enough to understand what's happening here, what's really going on. He says it's foolishness not to put understanding and delight in that before the need to express our own hearts. And in verse 13 of chapter 18, he says, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and a shame to him. Now, there's a lot of us in this room that have been through the raising of teenagers and young adults, and you understand this one. When you talk to your children and you're trying to give guidance to them, and every answer out of their mouth is, yeah, but. Yeah, but what about this? Yeah, but what about that? Every word you say, everything that's coming out, they're already thinking ahead of you to answer the thing you're telling them. And that's what they were doing with God in a certain sense. They're throwing all this stuff out there and not stopping long enough. It's important for us to be able to listen. And to do that properly, we have to be silent. And God's word will direct us and give us guidance if we stop long enough to listen. And don't get into that mode of saying, yeah, but what about this? Or what about that? Well, next he talks about, in this journey in God's word, we see that they come across the need for food. They need something to eat. It's natural. Perhaps they had some things with them when they started the journey, but now they're running out. They need something to eat. As I mentioned, Bryson's going to cover this section here in a future lesson. But what we can learn from this is that God hears our complaints, our concerns. He hears those things. But quite often, the answer we receive fulfills the need that we have and not the want that we have. We might look at passages like Mark 11:24, and where it says, therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them and you will have them. You know, the context here is Jesus is going with his disciples into the city, and there's a fig tree, and he wants something to eat. He goes up to the fig tree, and there's no fruit on it. And he says to the fig tree, well, basically, may you never feed anyone else again. They go on into the city, and then when they're coming back out, one of the disciples says, hey, that's that tree you talked to earlier, isn't it? And it's all withered up and dried up. And then he teaches this lesson to them about asking and having faith in what we ask for. You know, this is a passage that, admittedly, I've struggled with, because I look at it and I say, well, if I ask for something, whatever that is, I'm going to receive that. Almost 24 years ago, my father was sick with cancer, and he was in in the hospital and had been in there for, I don't know, about at least a week at this point. And I was, we were kind of taking shifts at the hospital. You know, I was, and my mom and my brother. And at this point, I had gotten into the routine of I was working during the day in the morning, and then I would go home for a bit and clean up and maybe rest for an hour or something, and then come up to the hospital in the evening and stay through the night and then repeat. And it would just cycle like that. And at this point, I think I may have had about a total of 6 hours of sleep for the week. I mean, it was just, I was in my 20s then, and I could handle it a little better, at least so I thought. And so this night comes, it was a Thursday evening, and I remember my dad sitting there. He was on the side of the bed, sitting up at that point, and just could barely breathe. The cancer had taken over so much, and could barely breathe. And I was worn out, he was worn out, and so I got him into bed, and we dimmed the lights. And I remember laying there, my eyes closed, and just praying. And I knew I shouldn't have used this example. I was going to try to think of something else, but I couldn't. I remember praying about this, and I remember saying, you know, asking for relief for him, for all the struggle he was going through, the difficulty. And in my mind, what that meant was, God, heal him. Make this go away. That's what I was thinking. And so the lights were out, and I was so tired, I fell asleep. And the next thing that happens is the lights all in the room come on, and 3 or 4 nurses come in the room. He'd stopped breathing. And he passed away that night. It's taken me, I don't know, this many years to start to understand that a little bit. To understand that God gives us what we need when we need it. And I'll tell you, I look at that and that example, and I say, well, how is that what I needed? How's that what my family needed? It's not. It's hard. But you have to understand that God sees things from a very different perspective. Our timetable is not His. God's timetable is eternal. It's not like ours. We think of things in very finite terms, in very, very small terms. But as God's word said, our life is a vapor. It's a very short time. And God's looking at a much bigger picture of things. And so these difficult things that are hard to understand, we have to think about them in terms of our timetable is not His, and our desires are not His. That doesn't mean that He doesn't care for us, and doesn't love us, and doesn't look at these things and understand that they're difficult for us. He certainly does. He knows that. But when we look at these things, we have to start to understand that He's really given us oftentimes what we need. Perhaps it was not what I needed at that point. Maybe it's what my dad needed because of the struggle he was having at that point. And so when we think about this idea of the manna that is there, that is provided, and I'm sure this will come out in the lesson, but they wanted food. They wanted something. They may have wanted something very different than what they were given. And what they were given, they were going to eat it for the next 40 years. But God took care of their needs. He took care of what they had need of and made sure that they were nourished. We might look at all this and the words of the song come to mind. Farther along. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. All these things in our life that are difficult, God was teaching him a lesson there. You'll understand these things. It's hard now. You're going through this difficult place, this desert place. You'll understand them one day. They will make sense to you. Well, we're going to come up beyond this now to the Amalekites. Anderson's going to talk about this. When we divided up these lessons, I guess last year at some point, and I was given the section that I had to kind of organize the team, Anderson came up to me right after that and he says, hey, I want to do that lesson on the Amalekites. And anybody that volunteers for a lesson, you got it. It's immediate. I mean, you don't have to argue. I'm not going to argue with you. So he took that lesson, and I'll tell you, there's a lot to this. There's so much to this particular piece that he's not even going to have enough time to cover it all. He's struggling to figure out how to squeeze it into a Wednesday night, but there's a lot to this, and it's very important. So I would encourage you to read that in chapter 17 and think about that. He's going to do his best to give us a little bit of the outside history, but then make the lessons for us on that. We might think that the reason they didn't take a different route out of Egypt was because they weren't ready to fight. That's kind of a thing we've kicked around, many of us that have been working on this, and we've thought, well, they didn't take that route up this way because they wouldn't be ready to fight. They wouldn't be, they weren't warriors. They were construction workers, if you will. They were making bricks and building buildings, and that's what they did. They weren't ready to go fight. The more I thought about this, the more I kind of said, well, they faced a battle anyway. I mean, one way or another, they faced a battle, whether it was up this way or going a different route, they faced it. To me, the real reason that this particular thing happens is that it's a lesson that we all need to be prepared to hear. It's something that we need to hear in our own lives. Because you and I are not warriors that are ready to face some of the battles that we're going to face. You and I don't sit around and get trained to face some of the things that come into our lives. We just don't. I can tell you there's been plenty of things in my life, I just gave you an example of one of them, that there was no part of my life leading up to that point where I trained for that, to be ready. It didn't happen. There have been other things in my life since then that are the exact same thing. I was not ready for those. I was not trained for them. At least not in the sense of, okay, this event's going to come along and this is what I'm going to do with it. I have God's word to lean on, and that's been my training, but to sit and look at a particular situation, that doesn't happen. And that's what we see happening here. Very often we're faced with battles in our life that shake us to the core. They're things that come out of seemingly nowhere and they hit us. They hit us hard. They cause us to doubt. They cause us to cry. They cause us to not understand life and what's going on. Why is this way? And what we learn from that is that they were not ready. These people were not ready. But God was ready. And that's the lesson he wanted them to know. You're not ready, but I am, he says. Whatever you face in your life, whatever difficulty, lean back on that. You may not be ready, but God will be. And dealing with struggles and adversity is a topic that we can hopefully unpack maybe in future lessons. Some of us have had some discussions about perhaps some lessons that we could talk through on that. But God's word makes it clear that it's pretty normal for us to struggle with these things. When we're faced with them, it's normal. A man after God's own heart, David, struggled with this. If you look at Psalm 13, verses 1 through 4, David asked these questions. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Here you see a man that's hurting. He's having difficulty with the battles that he is facing in his life. the things that are going on around him. And he's looking to God and saying, where are you? Where are you? How long are these things going to keep bothering me? He struggled with it. We struggle with this very same thing. We'll talk more in depth about this in an upcoming Wednesday night, but it's a very important lesson that they needed to learn. They had to learn was where to look for their strength and their support when the battle was before them. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. We can plan a lot of things in our life. We may have directions that we think we want to go, but ultimately, it's God who's directing the steps in our life. I'm looking around this room, and I see individuals here today who I know their steps have been directed in certain ways and for certain reasons. And I'm thankful for those things because the Lord is directing them and helping them through the battles in which they are struggling. Well, chapter 18, we get into a section along the journey. They've been making this journey. And I want to think back to, just kind of go backwards a little bit here for just a moment. The people had left behind slavery. And if you really think about this a little bit, Pharaoh was the one in charge. He was calling the shots. It's tyranny is what it is. It's one person who's saying, this is how we're going to do these things. That's what they had lived under. And so all their daily routine was directed by that. Not personally, he's not telling each individual what to do, but overall he's saying, here's how we're going to do things. And so they were being told when to get up, when to go to bed, what to eat, when to work, how to work. Everything in their life was directed. If there was conflicts and difficulty in their life, maybe they had a way to complain about that, but most likely it was probably going to be handled with a beating or death. And maybe one led to the other. That's what they knew. And so there probably wasn't a whole lot of complaining. It was probably keep your head down and just do the task that was before you. And so here they find themselves out in the desert, going along here. They've had the issue of water and food and all these things, and they're moving along. And keep in mind, and we've talked about this in past lessons, we're talking about kind of like Oklahoma City, all the people moving together, a long journey. A lot of people. And what's going to happen with that? Well, they don't get along. They struggle. They have difficulties. And so what ends up happening is all these people are having trouble, and they're going to Moses, and they're saying, Moses, what do we do? Who's right? I'm right. This person thinks they're right. Who's right? And Moses is making decisions. What they didn't realize is that as they're going through this, they had left Pharaoh and being told what to do every day. And because that's what they knew, they had acclimated to that, now they're going back to Moses, and they're kind of drawing themselves up to one man and saying, what do we do? How do we handle ourselves? In a sense, they had exchanged, one man for another. And Moses, thinking that he's doing the right thing, is just answering their questions, trying to help them resolve these things. And it was difficult. It's wearing him out. And so we see in this section in chapter 18, his father-in-law meets them along the way and provides some advice. And I'm going to let Scott Barris talk about that when he gets into more detail. Proverbs 12, verse 15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. I'm sure Moses thought he was doing the right thing here. Seems like the logical thing. Hey, I brought these people out here. They've got trouble. I've got to help them sort it out. He thought he was doing the right thing. But he really wasn't. He was actually causing some more challenge for them. Do we believe our ways are correct? You ever think about that? Do you think, well, my way must be the right way? I mean, this seems to be the right thing to do, and I feel like I'm right. That happens a lot in our life. It happens to me. Sometimes someone comes along that helps us understand something different. How often do we turn away from wise counsel because we want to continue to forge ahead in the path that we think is right? How often do we just say, tune those people out that are trying to help guide us and help us to do the right thing? This section is as much for Moses as it is for the people. Because, Moses needed to learn that while his actions, seemingly helpful, were actually not helping them. Because it's not where God wanted them to be. It's not what God wanted them to be and how he wanted them to handle things in their life. And so Moses needed to learn this lesson. He needed wise counsel to come along. It always interests me that they're going along and moving through here, and here his father-in-law shows up to give that advice, that bit of information that he desperately needed right then, how to handle those things. For the people, there's a lesson as well, and that's that they needed to be mindful that they risked trading one tyrant for another. That's what they were doing. Not that Moses was trying to be a tyrant. He, again, thought he was doing the right thing, but they, because of what they had acclimated to, were saying, well, we're no longer under Pharaoh, so Moses must be our guy. He must be our new Pharaoh, if you will. He's our new leader, so what do you want us to do, Pharaoh, or Moses? We have to be careful that we don't leave behind one bad thing for another. We don't leave one tyrant and fall in under another tyrant. And that's what can happen with things in our life, with sin and bad things that come up. We can say, well, yeah, I turned away from this sin in my life, and we can end up with something else. And that's what very often happens to people, is they get rid of one thing, but it leaves this void, and the only thing they know is to backfill it with something else that's equally as bad. Are we trading one tyrant for another, is the question to consider. Well, after all this, they do end up at Mount Sinai. They end up at Mount Sinai, out in the desert here in this area, and God brings them to this mountain. And here, God makes a covenant with the people. He puts something before them to consider. In chapter 19, verse 5 and 6, he says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests." And look at these words, a holy nation. A holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. That word nation is important. God is telling them, you are now going to be your own nation. They had lived all these years under the Egyptians. That was their identity, as slaves to Egypt. And now he's saying, if you listen, he bookmarks this whole section we're talking about from the sea to the mountain with listen. If you listen, he says, you are going to be a nation. And what comes after this, that will be talked about in the next section in February, is the things that God puts out before them from the mountain. The laws, the Ten Commandments, the things that he tells them and says, you need to follow these things. Listen to God and you will be a nation, he says there. I want to ask you this question. If you think about your journey, have you reached the mountain of God only to turn back? This was not the end of their journey. This was a stopover point. This is where God's going to give them these laws, but going forward beyond this, they still had a long ways to go before they would enter the promised land. And when they entered the promised land, they still had many battles to face. There was a long road ahead of them. So the question becomes, have you reached the mountain of God only to turn back? They've gone all the way on this journey, And they could have said, yeah, no, I think we're just going to go ahead and head back. And that's really what's before us sometimes. Does the past look enticing to you? Do you go through this journey, through all the battles and the difficulties, and you see God providing for you and all these things, and you get to this point, standing at the mountain, and you're saying, well, I've got God's word, but, I think I'm going to go backwards. Is it easier to go back than to go forward? Like I said, they had a whole lot of difficulty ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. But God was saying, I'm with you on this. If you'll listen to me, I'll take you where you need to go. If you think about your life and compare that to what we looked at earlier, going from the sea to the mountain, are you caught in a cycle of making that journey? Have you reached that mountain only to be enticed to go back to where you were earlier in your life? Does that past look better? Do you float back to that and then have to start all over again and work through all these difficulties? Do you have to learn all over again to listen to God? Do you have to learn all over again to trust His provisions? Do you have to listen to wise counsel? Are you caught in that cycle? Something for us to consider and think about. They weren't going back. They had to go forward. They had to look forward. And we should too. We should continue to look forward. And so I want to think about the provisions for the journey. This is kind of where I want to bring it all to summation, if you will, for this part today. I mentioned my dad earlier. My dad always had a way of, anytime he preached, he would always kind of end lessons with, basically, how does this apply to me? What do I do with this? He could be preaching about anything. And it was, what do you do with this? And so I do that too, that's how I learned to do it. Provisions for the journey. What are we going to take with us? What are you going to do with what we learned today, and how are you going to apply that? Well, the first one is look forward, not backward. That's where I just ended a minute ago. Look forward, not backward. It is so easy in your life to start to get drawn back to the past. Things that you did in the past, they may feel like they were home. They may feel like they're easy. You may feel like they were comfortable to you. But they're drawing you back to a place that Satan wants you to go, and that's not where you need to be. You've got to look forward. And when you do, there are difficulties ahead. It's not easy. It's not going to be a simple journey ahead. You're going to have battles to face. There are individuals in this room today that are going to face things this week. They've got something on their plate coming up this week. They're going to have a battle before them. And if that's you, I would encourage you to think, look forward. Where am I going? What has God promised? And how do I keep moving forward toward that? Be silent and listen. Be silent and listen. If I was going to tell someone who was picking up a Bible, and there's a lot of things in here to read, and oftentimes somebody will be trying to sort through their life, and maybe they have very little history with God's Word. Maybe they just weren't raised to look at it. Maybe they just haven't spent any time in it. And they open their Bible and they say, well, where do I start? And naturally, well, sometimes we'll just start at the beginning like we do with any book, you start reading, and that's fine. If I was going to tell someone where to start, here's what I would tell them. I would say go to Matthew, the 5th chapter, and read 5, 6, and 7. Everything else will come in time. But if you were looking for what you need to do in your life, go to Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And the reason is because Jesus had brought these people along, these disciples. They were traveling through their life, and they're dealing with the difficulties. They didn't know what they needed to do and how they needed to do it. They're living under a tyrannical government that's telling them what to do and how to do it, and they're looking for answers. And he brings them to a mountain. Isn't that interesting? He brings them to a mountain, just like God brought the Israelites to a mountain. And he brings them out there, and he sits them down, and he begins to teach them. So I would tell someone today, if you're looking to figure out how you need to navigate this journey, start there, because he gives a lot of great thought in there. He starts out in chapter 5, verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." When I say poor in spirit, there's a lot involved in that. But if you go back to where I started with all this, it's the idea of learning to listen and be silent. Being poor in spirit means that I stop trying to figure it out on my own. I stop trying to let my mind go crazy in all these directions. How am I going to make this work out? Instead, I stop and I listen. He's trying to tell them to slow down and listen. That's how he starts out this great sermon. He covers a variety of topics in there, and they're in little chunks that you can read and you can think about in your life. And he gets to the end of it in chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. He says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." He bookends this great teaching, chapters 5, 6, and 7, with the idea of listening. Listening. I would encourage anyone, if you're trying to look at what I need to do in my life, if you're in this desert, if you will, and trying to say, what do I need to do and how do I need to move forward, read those passages and start to think about what Jesus is telling them. Then the idea of trust and what God has provided. As I mentioned earlier, the idea that God's going to provide us what we need when we need it. It's important for us to understand that. And it may not make any sense to you at the time. And sometimes it may take many, many years before it does. And sometimes those things in our life, we may never understand them until we get to a point where we are home with Him. And then farther along, as I said, it will make sense. And then ready or not, battles lie ahead. I'm just going to tell you right now, if you haven't hit them, and I've said this before in other lessons, they're coming. They're going to be there. I said this in a lesson a while back, speaking to young people that are looking toward being married. Let me just tell you, the battles are coming. There's going to be challenges, whether that's some conflict in your home, whether that's things that are unexpected that happen to your family. They're coming. Be ready for them. Build your house on the rock. Build your house on God's word. When those things come, when they do, not if, but when, you'll be ready for them. Be ready to seek and heed wise counsel. Sometimes we seek wise counsel. We look for it. We say, hey, I need some advice. And when it's given, maybe we turn away from that. Maybe we say, okay, well, thank you. But then we still try to forge ahead on our own path. I would encourage you to listen to wise counsel. Seek that out. There's so much wisdom just sitting in this room. I can't remember, I've mentioned it before, I can't remember Randy's saying that he told me one time. It has to do with, basically I'm gonna paraphrase this, but basically you're smart because you do dumb things, and dumb things, you learn from them and make you smart. He said it much better, more eloquent, because he's smarter than me, and that implies he's made a lot of mistakes. But we learn because we make those mistakes. But we are sitting in a room with people who've made a lot of mistakes and dealt with a lot of challenge and difficulty, and there's a lot of wise counsel that can be had from that. So listen to those things, and then remain focused on the destination. This mountain that they went to, this was not the destination. There was a destination far beyond this, and that's the way it is in our life. We're sitting here and we are looking forward down the road to a destination we don't see with our own eyes, but we know is out there. Look forward to that. And when those things in the past are enticing you and drawing you back, remember that and keep looking forward. There's difficulties that are coming our way. It's not going to be easy, but we can continue to look forward and trust that God will lead us where we need to go. Well, this concludes my thoughts. As I said, we'll have some additional lessons that will come, and we'll expand on these sections. So I just wanted to give you a little taste of it today, and maybe give you something to use as you journey through the days ahead. I hope you'll come back this afternoon. John's going to talk about water and their trouble there and their struggles, and he'll get more in detail on that. And then we'll have future lessons to talk about these other areas. Today, you may be here and you may have been a Christian for a long time, and maybe you have found yourself in that cycle of bouncing between the sea and the mountain. Maybe you get right up there to the foot of the mountain and you hear God's word, and then you get enticed to go back. And you feel like you're in this constant struggle. We can pray with you about those things. We have a whole room full of people that pray. They pray throughout the week. We can pray with you today, and we can put those concerns before this group, and they can pray with you or pray for you throughout the week. Perhaps you're here today and you have never entered the waters of baptism. What a great time to do that. What a great time to go through those waters, just like the Israelites did. They went through there. Let sin be swallowed up in that water and come out on the other side a new person, ready to move forward in life, ready to go through the things that are ahead. You're going to come out of there, and it's going to be a difficult challenge. It's going to be a desert before you. There's going to be more lessons to learn. But you can come out on that side being led by God and being led to that final destination. Whatever needs you have today, if you have a need that we can help you with, please come and sit on the front row while we stand together and sing.